welcome to what I believe is the 68th or 69th, something along there, RPG Book Club. Today we are looking at Retrograde, which is a retro-futurist sci-fi tabletop role-playing game of investigation, exploration, and survival. Faster-than-light travel has been made possible by supernatural means, and a mutant gene allows for starship navigators to teleport their ships across vast gulfs of space. There are powers beyond human comprehension governing the mechanisms of the universe. Unraveling such hidden knowledge will be perilous, to say the least. And here we have just some of the general stuff you'll need to play, which is fairly consistent with other games. A content advisory, which is a little general, but not necessarily harmful in any way. Yep, basic suggestion about session 0. And then we'll right into character creation. I feel like I'm not that well acquainted with the game yet, but I feel like this doesn't really give a great description of what exactly it is I'm looking at. Maybe this is, this rulebook is more intended for people who have already read some material for the game, because I can't remember if this is like a general rulebook or a stripped down free version, but either way, it might be good to have a bit better of a description than this, because I can't really quite tell what the game is going for just from that. And we're already into character creation. Okay, you need to choose a star sign, a specialization, and get weapons and gear. Basic stats, it looks like mind, body, and soul. And that's mental, physical, and spiritual. They have skills associated with it, so fairly similar to the standard D20 format, other than probably not being with D20s. Associated hit point pool representing a character's ability to survive danger. Follow these steps to create your character. Not bad to establish that, hit point isn't directly how healthy your character is off the bat. It's nice to establish that. Assign a value of 8 to the attribute you want your character to be best at, 7 to the next, and 6 to the last. So those are all fairly close together. That doesn't give a lot of variety in terms of character creation, and for a lot of games, the stats are what are really gonna sort of define your character, at least mechanically, early on. But maybe there's more focus on skill proficiencies for this or something like that. We'll see. Okay, each attribute's value is also cap on its respective skills. Yep. Give sanity the same value as mind, health the same value as body, and spirit the same value as soul. Then that's your hit points. Okay. It's not really clear from this whether the hit points are how important the hit points being separate pools are going to be. I mean, they are separate pools instead of just your hit points being a combination of the values for these stats. So obviously their separation is going to matter to some extent, but we'll see how well they come together. Or if they're really separate hit point pools at all instead of just different, resource pools with fully separate fail conditions. Assign 2 points to each skill, then distribute additional points freely across all skills, according to the number of players and the desired difficulty level. Reducing each character's total number of skill points makes it more challenging. Discuss with the librarian, which I'm guessing is the DM. I'm not sure if they've established that yet or not. And refer to the table below to determine the total number of skill points appropriate for your game. Just gonna give a quick check. Yeah, it looks like... yeah, it looks like this is the earliest use of the term librarian, but it's not actually defined there. That's probably not a great idea if that's the equivalent of GM, as I'm assuming. Okay, number of players, difficulty level, standard, challenging. 72 total skill points, and is that per player? So, like, the obvious thing here, what I would assume, is that each player gets this amount of skill points, just because otherwise things would get very weird and very complicated. But the way it's written, it's hard to tell whether or not this is like a skill point pool total that each player has to take from. That's the way it's written, sort of makes it seem. Because you distribute additional points freely across all skills according to the number of players and the desired difficulty level. Reducing, okay, each character's total numbers. So it does fully establish that this is for all people, or rather that this is, for each individual and not a pool of the total. But there's only really one line for that, so maybe make that a bit more explicit. Because, just 72 total skill points, and then distribute additional points freely across all skills according to the number of players and the desired difficulty level kind of makes it seem like it's a universal pool of points rather than per character. And like I said, this phrase shows what it is, but there's, it's only sort of mentioned once. You might want to make it a bit clearer throughout the rest of the text. Alright, choose a star sign, develop a specialization, choose your character's starting weapons and gear. I would like to sort of have an example of the kind of skills that exist in the game at this point, because I'm still not getting, a clear idea of what exactly kind of characters you can make from the game. And even in a general overview of character creation, I'd sort of want that idea, but I'm not getting it. Because there are only 3 stats. There is not a huge amount of variance to those stats for any character. And then skills are probably going to dictate a lot because you can allocate points relatively freely. But without an idea of what kind of things are skills, that really doesn't tell me much about the kind of characters you'll be creating for this game. Character sheet. There are the attributes, the different hit point pools. Okay, now I'm seeing the skills. I would say that probably covers it then. Like, you could have examples of skills around here, but since the character sheet comes up so soon and that has the skills listed, I would say that's close enough. And yeah, and you automatically get 2. You get stuff like synthesis, perception, jerry-rigging, medicine, research knowledge, mind, dexterity, athletics, hand-to-hand combat, marksmanship, piloting, stealth, instinct, empathy, willpower, charm, intimidation, esoterica. Yeah, and I think these are... I wouldn't think you necessarily need any one of these fully described from the outset to give people an idea of what they are. I'm guessing they're going to be relatively well connected to their names. Like, there's a few things like synthesis that I might not really know what that's supposed to mean off the bat, but most of it is relatively self-explanatory, so I think you don't really need skill examples like I was concerned you might earlier. And there's a star sign, specialization, which I'm guessing is sort of like class, gear, death saves. Interesting to go with that system, because I feel like, most games that aren't directly copying D20, death saves is the first thing they get rid of. But in fairness, I have also seen a lot of systems that have their death system just not fully finished or explained. So going with something established, even if it's not that popular, might not be a bad idea. Specialization, controls, notes, Star signs. Okay, so those born on planets beyond Earth are born under different stars, so there's a new meaning to astrology. It's kind of, I think, important to establish what meaning star signs or astrology had before that point, since most people just consider it meaningless in this day and age. Okay, many still look to the old sides of to the zodiac for signs of guidance, but yeah, so each sector sort of has its own, like astrology, but this sort of makes it seem like astrology was already an established and like I don't know what you'd call it, like an established force, I guess, in the setting before uh space travel even. And while there are certainly still people that believe in astrology here, I would say it is not really that many, at least that, like really truly believe in it. So I would definitely want them to establish what exactly astrology means in any context, not just in the context of alternate galaxies. Okay, star signs provide a bonus to your success threshold for certain saving throws. And also serve as a jumping off point for developing Yokoto's story. Interesting. Seeing some signs around here. Core worlds. Cumberland sector. So, just from the term, star signs, you would think it would be like what specific signs, are important to your character. But it looks like, from what I'm seeing now, it's not quite that. It's more like what galaxy's group of star signs are important to you. In other words, basically just what galaxy was your character born in. Which seems like a bit of a mismatch, but let's see. Yeah, so citizens of the core world. So you really don't necessarily have to be directly from there, but it is people who are like directly linked to that group of planets. It's hard for me to say that this description really has anything that I would connect to star signs or astrology, really. Like, I guess you could say that this stuff is what influences it, because, I think part of the reasons it's being done this way is just to make it slightly more mystical, but also because it's hard to establish why the people of a certain galaxy would have a certain unified buff, given that a galaxy is such a big place with so many different things inside of it and different ways of living, that it would be sort of odd for all of the people from a certain galaxy to have specific connections, regardless of race or planet of origin. And so I think trying to link it to star signs gives more of a justification for that, but just generally reading this, it really doesn't, scream star sign or astrology or anything like that. Shipyard for Gutenberg Inc. Is that like incorporated but with a K, or like actual pen ink? And it's a little odd that it's, that it's shipping and mercenary work for an industrial world. I guess maybe all of the actual manufacturing is done by robots, but even then, you would expect the careers from this area that a player character might have to have more of a direct link to industry, even though shipping is fairly, strongly connected to industry. It's not as connected to some other things. Especially attuned to blood ink. Like, yeah, no, this is definitely star signs, because it's the threshold stuff. I was wondering if I, somehow messed up and there was some kind of Galaxy of Origin portion that I was reading, and this wasn't actually star signs, despite following up the description of them, but definitely seems like star signs. And this, this is vaguely star related, at least. Okay. And blood ink mutation, that's definitely something. Alright, specializations. I'm definitely going to go back just to make sure I'm getting this right. So this is definitely star signs. Yeah, it's just not what you would expect for that at all. Okay, specializations. Okay, skill you have at least 6 points in, and that is a specialized skill. Then you have a special application of that specialized skill. Yeah, I don't like some of the redundancy of these descriptions, like special is being reused a bit, and then we have choose a specific application of that skill, such as a skill, basically, which is not helpful language. Specializations are not confined to a particular list, and ultimately the specifics of a specialization and its benefits are determined by a conversation with the player and a librarian. Okay. So, like a lot of systems, there's sort of a free form here where you just have a word that relates to a skill, and you're particularly good at that thing. And, that can really be anything as long as the GM agrees. I think we're still using librarian without establishing what that means, right? Yeah, it's definitely too late at this point to not have a definition of that term. Gain advantage on skill set checks using a specialization. You gain a unique piece of gear. Yeah, I don't really like this. It seems like like the benefit of having things be general like this and not have a specific list to choose from is that it can, be more realistic. It can give a player more options. When you take that and then turn it into a set of specific mechanics, it sort of conflates with that benefit. And so first you just get advantage, which, involving one specific word, which isn't really that exciting. And then this, you get a unique piece of gear that does its own special thing that seems more complex and specialized than the specialization itself. It kind of seems like, there's not really a reason for the gear and the specialization to be linked. You could either have them be entirely separate things, or even forego the idea of specialization entirely and just have it be that you have a gear that specialized gear that corresponds to one of your stats, and there's no specialized skill aspect of it to one of your skills. I mean, like, instead of having, say the skill is charm, then the specialization is acting, and that gives you advantage. And then you have a special acting gear, which basically has its own unique ability, it seems like. You could probably just cut out the middleman there and cut out the acting specialization and just have, you're good at charm, and then you have a special acting outfit that has a special ability. Like the hollow makeup, it's good that my example in this happened to align. The hollow makeup is ultimately more interesting than getting advantage at things involving acting, to the point that I might just forego the idea of specialization, the an actor part of it entirely, and just say, your character is good at charm, and then has a kit of hollow makeup to act with in reference to that. But then there are other things that involve specializations. You gain a contact. Okay. So this sort of seems like a combination of class and background that links to a skill and, is largely, created freeform with the GM. Okay, and you can do things that are relevant to the specialization. Like, none of this is really, bad or anything per se. I just feel like it's not well defined. Like, all of these sets of abilities, sort of seem like a background or a backstory, and having them relate to a skill isn't bad, but having it be like a skill specialization seems like the wrong thing to call it. Like, for something like this, and it's not as easy to, well, also the format might be off. Like, if I go back up here, we've got hand-to-hand combat and marksmanship, and we're saying that for either of those skills, the specialization of combat styles would work the same. I don't like how a lot of this is defined, and again with this, if instead of combat styles this was like mercenary, like a specific job that pertained to that skill, it would be a lot easier to tie gear and contacts and, the other things that this seems to be going for to it than just having a contact in a combat style is kind of odd to me. So, like, I'm fine with most aspects of this. It's, like I said, kind of like a class background backstory combination that you create entirely with a GM, and that's not always my preference, but it's not, like definitively bad or anything, but taking that whole thing and calling it just a sub specialization of a skill seems to be doing it a disservice on what it's supposed to be. Now, I can't, like, get any more specific than that or say these specific things are contradictory about it because it is not, a set of rules with a specific mechanic. It is just something more freeform. So I have to be somewhat freeform in the way I describe what I think could be changed about it, but basically just, I think all of this being said to be like a subset of a skill is reductive. Right, faster than light travel in Retrograde is accomplished by a mystical practice called blinking. Formerly, blood ink teleportation. It's funny because, like, blood ink goes into blink really well, but then teleportation isn't part of that. It seems like blinking, just reading through it, it seemed like blinking was supposed to be some sort of portmanteau of blood ink, but then teleportation and the ing just don't really match up, so I don't know if there's something going on with that or not. Also, I didn't say anything because I felt like it was premature, but a lot of the posts about this sort of revolved around the idea of tattooing and printmaking. But, the first mention I've really seen of that in the core book itself is on, like, page 8. So having stuff like this in the beginning description of what the game is would probably be a good idea. Okay, a small percentage of the human population throughout the galaxy. Just the human population, or all there only humans? Which I kind of assume there would be aliens, just because it's in space, but maybe there won't be. Blood ink mutation, imbuing their blood with occult power. Is this something... Like, I guess you could argue that we shouldn't have that information yet, it should only be in setting, but at this point, I would like to know, like, is this something that came from space travel, or is it what caused it? When exactly did this happen? Has blood ink always been a thing within this universe, or was it more like our universe and then something changed or was discovered? Okay, given the proper training and conditioning, those with blood ink mutation can mix their blood with ink into ink, which, when used to print star maps, teleports the printing press to the exact location depicted on the star chart. Are we saying the person is a printing press now? Or do you just literally teleport printing presses, which does not seem that helpful? So I'm guessing printing press, either people are using printing presses as spaceships, or people have, people that can do this are referred to as printing presses, but that hasn't been established yet, so it just comes off as confusing. It's not represented in a specific way on a player's character sheet beyond the blinking specialization. The properties of blood ink are poorly understood and may be possible for characters to discover their latent blood ink powers later in their adventuring, possibly even acquiring the blood ink mutation itself. So this is not necessarily something that characters have at the outset, or even at all, maybe. Technology. Another interesting thing about it is, since this is all directly teleporting, well, I guess we know that there is slower than light travel between planets, so I guess there's space travel in that sense, but the really long-haul space travel is not actually traveling through space, it's just teleportation, which I probably could have picked up on earlier, but I didn't really think about to this point. Right, it's the only known instant of anything traveling faster than the speed of light. Right, so does that mean... because that's not just, man-made stuff, that's any even type of energy or anything has not been discovered to travel faster than light. Okay, the chief way information is conveyed between different worlds is by print mass media, with sanguine-type telepress ships carrying newspapers and books to far-flung planets in their interstellar travels. so it is somewhat confusing why once these ships arrived on other planets, there would not simply be communication from those ships to other places with radio, or the data itself would be stored on some sort of computer rather than, like, internet's in quotes, so I don't know if they're supposed to have computers or not, but it's not clear at this point where, if the information is first transported physically, why that would necessarily mean it is transported through text. If the text itself could be directly transmitted between planets through some form of blood ink thing, I think that would tie more directly into the press theme, and would also be a more direct reason why writing is the main form of communication across planets, but I don't really know yet, because a lot of this stuff, like Sanguine-type telepress, is completely unfamiliar to me at this point. While some highly developed worlds under the auspice of Gutenberg Inc. may be technologically advanced beyond an early 21st century level, many worlds may function on a technological level closer to Earth societies in the 19th century or earlier. I think that's interesting and definitely possible with the means of travel that they have, since, not necessarily a lot of people will be traveling this way, and even if the initial inhabitants of a planet had a certain level of technology, since it would mostly be their descendants which inhabited the planet afterward, a lot of stuff could be lost, so I think this is definitely plausible. This is especially true of so-called lost worlds, planets born from earlier interstellar colonization that have fallen out of contact with civilized space and are beyond reach of Gutenberg Inc. Hey, weapons and gears. A character's specialization informs their starting gear. Okay. Yeah, I don't really like this. Like, there are gonna be certain basic necessities that anyone might need, I feel like, which are not really being covered here. And, like, it's just so much is being left up to the, left up to whatever players and the GM decides at this point, that there's not a lot there, and for this especially, that can be bad, because it's not just one thing, it's like everything a character might have is entirely dictated by what the GM might allow, and also, whatever specific subset of a skill you choose. So basically, someone with anything vaguely combat related could have any kind of weapon, and someone who does not have that basically can't have any kind of weapon, and that's a massive imbalance for this. Okay? Like, if you go into, I don't know if you have, like, created a bunch of specific items with defined variations of these traits, or you're just saying that when you're independently making your own gear, you should keep these traits in mind. But if you go into outline so much, I do feel like you may as well actually establish what gear, what characters start with. And maybe you can mention that they might have one or two extra items that relate to their specialization, but the rest of starting gear should probably be set if you're going to define what gear can be to this extent. Alright, standard weapons. Like, gear. Like, characters with industrial specializations should have a hand wielder or boarding axe. But boarding axe isn't really under industrial equipment. It does seem like it's like two different ideas of how you think gear should work here that aren't well meshed together. The flamethrower seems pretty good compared to other stuff, but there's no real guidance on whether it can be starting equipment or not, so I don't know if that is relevant to balance or not. Okay, so I was just rechecking that short and melee are different. Yeah, and I also feel like there probably needs to be something. Like, there's going to be a lot of variance between directly in front of you and across the room from you. Like, most things that have longer range have pretty long range. I feel like when we're talking about things that can be used as weapons. But then there is a lot of variance between these categories in terms of what can be used. But, that's just my assumptions about how various weapons might work. Like, most things that, can go down the street can go pretty far. Most things that can go across, say, 2 rooms can go down the street. I'm having trouble explaining it, but I just feel like these categories are not fully useful in a game context or necessarily representative of actual weapons either. Do 3 points of sanity. And you can stabilize. Okay. Still gear available. Likely be other, piece of equipment. Okay. Like, I think you really need a full description of what exactly the ink teleportation is and what kinds of other stuff the blood ink mutation can do. Because that's like the main core unique feature of the world and what a lot of the ways it is relies on. And I still don't have any sort of clear picture of what that's supposed to be. And it's, 12 pages in at this point out of a 30 or so page book. Right? Works via skill checks. Well, yep. Yep. Skill points to modify the results of skill checks. And that would make, future skill checks more difficult. I'll definitely have to see how that plays out. Okay, and it's specifically an immense amount of strain from a skill check, which is, a little substandard. That a skill check is not something that can be easily accomplished. There's no skill check necessary for that, is fairly standard with most systems, but that a skill check, spending skill points entails an immense. Okay, that makes more sense. So not all skill checks, just ones you are, damaging your own ability to do skills with. Okay? It's odd to start out with an example of play for what a skill check is, but, doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, it's just not how things are typically done. Dana attempts to sabotage something. The librarian calls for a jerry-rigging check. Is 5, so she rolls an 8 failure. On what basis? Dana chooses to spend 2 skill points. So is that skill points that are already allocated to skills, or floating skill points that haven't been allocated yet? To a success. Not clear why it needed to be 2 or really anything. Dana now has 3 jerry-rigging points remaining. Definitely feels like I'm missing something here. Or... okay, so I think I might have figured it out. Because I realized I was assuming this worked like a normal system, where skills are modifiers applied to checks, but in this case, skills might actually be a resource pool of points you can spend that are not applied to checks unless you can spend them. That's definitely very different than what you would typically expect, and it's not really been outlined anywhere up to this point. Alright, so I'm gonna move on a bit to try and find if skill checks are ever actually explained, and if they're not, I'm probably just gonna call it here, because that's a pretty big oversight. Say critical failure. Okay, modified. Yes, okay. So it's not really saying how these work, which is a concern. I'm looking back here to see if there's any clue now, because I also don't know if attributes are applied or if they exclusively represent your hit point pool and the cap for your skill points. Okay. Yeah, so there's nothing really that explicitly, contradicts the idea that the skill points is a resource pool rather than anything else, but that is very atypical and I think should be explicitly explained at this point. When you're talking about actually allocating skills, what that actually means. And also, even, forgetting that it's atypical and not explained at the beginning, it doesn't seem to be explained later either. I don't know how you actually do a skill check here. Okay, so now are we finally getting into it here? Character attempts to do something that's not obviously feasible. Skill check. 1d12 against the success threshold, which is the current points value of the relevant skill. Less than a success threshold. Okay, success. Yep, roll is equal to success threshold. Partial success is greater than success threshold. Failure, then you can spend 2 points specifically. 1 point. Oh, so it's not. I would have thought, spending points is relevant to the degree of failure. Like, I would have assumed you could modify your roll with skill points, but it's just you modify the success directly, which is a bit more forgiving, which is nice, I suppose, since, these are things you get at character creation that you're spending to succeed. Well, it's not necessarily the more you fail, the harder success becomes. It's more the more you strain yourself to succeed, the harder success becomes. I think these are cool charts, but that nowhere the actual just plain text rules of a skill check are listed is a problem, and that the example of play comes before the rule is described is very much a problem. That just shouldn't happen here. Like if I was reading this in a format where pages were next to each other, maybe these pages would be next to each other, in which case it would be easier to recognize that I don't necessarily read the example of play where it is placed. But, even then, I think placement is a bit awkward. The rules not just being written out in any form so far is awkward. Because, flowcharts can be very helpful for some people to visualize things or help them understand things. But what it is basically doing here is taking a relatively simple rule. You roll a d12 under your skill, and then if you don't successfully roll under, you spend skill points to succeed. That took like 2 sentences to say, and it takes a whole page of text and visuals without that. So I'm not saying this is bad at all, it's just, it is very strange that the rules are not written just straight out anywhere. Okay. Okay. How do they wake up again at that point? That cannot just be a note. That dramatically changes everything. And I don't know that you should have it in at all if like the whole point of this system is that modifying into success is such a permanent strain. You really shouldn't be able to just use hit points to cover it, even though I acknowledge that spending hit points could potentially be quite dangerous. Okay. And skill just determines, what the difficulty is. But also, yeah, how many resources you have to spend to give yourself a chance at success. Yeah, I don't know that synthesis is really a good word for that. Esoterica. Okay. Fails or partially succeed, vulnerable to dangers or complications. I feel like this all comes down to just advice on how to run a game rather than any actual rule per se. Okay. Yeah, just 1 damage is pretty generous. Okay, rules for each relevant skill. So you make multiple rolls. But for failing, you would have to spend points from every skill. Okay. I think the example of play helps that make that a little understandable, so that comes out fine in the end. 1 skill point. Oh, skill points are not permanent. That means you have to have 2 separate pools, though. Because you have to have a max skill point and a skill point. A max skill point value and a skill point value. And that was not discussed in the rules. Yeah, because here you're not actually allocating your skill points, you're allocating your max skill points. If they're recoverable. Yeah, I'm gonna check how much more of this I want to read. Let's see. Okay. Rest, exhaustion, healing, dying, heart attacks, mental breaks, combat, recovery, survival. Alright, foraging. Non-player characters. What I'm mainly looking for is anything that would help me understand the setting better. Nothing so far. Maybe artifacts examples. Artifacts. Alright, that's interesting, but it doesn't really tell me a lot about the setting either. Alright, blood magic. How to manipulate the powers of blood ink. Of recently exsanguinated blood ink to perform. Okay, so the terminology here is not great because I don't know if the blink specialty is just the ability to teleport or any kind of blood ink stuff. Because, not the only ones who can learn blink spells. Does that mean like other blood ink stuff, or can they also learn to teleport? They just need to use someone else's blood ink. And again, I'm not really sure if blink is supposed to be just an abbreviation of blood ink, or it's supposed to refer to the teleportation thing specifically. Okay. So here's some of the magic, but again, it's not something. The only thing I've learned from this so far is that you don't have to have the blood ink mutation to use blood ink magic. You just need a source of the blood ink, which is interesting and maybe could have been established earlier, but either case, I'm glad it was established, but I really don't know how the travel works still. We'll teleport the printing press to exact location indicated by the star chart. Do star charts usually give exact locations, per se? I don't know enough to really know about that. Discovered and learned through the course of your adventures. Conditions. Okay. So, my general thoughts on this. Like, I'll be able to maybe, say more in my actual posts when I know if this is supposed to be an abbreviated rule set or not. But first of all, and I didn't really think about this before, but no table of contents. That's not a great start. Yeah. It's hard for me to know what exactly to say here. Because I don't want to come off as too critical. Just for general sake, and also because, like, this isn't like it's not like a broken mess or anything. It's just hard to say, and I haven't gone over everything either. It's just hard to say what exactly it is. Because, it's a game where there's space travel by teleportation with blood ink, but any more information on that, I really don't have at this point. And that's an interesting idea for a world, I really think it is. But with only like that little blurb of information that I have so far, that world isn't really a draw to reading this document. In terms of the rules of the document, I would say they are not super compelling. You don't have a ton of variety in terms of attributes for your character at character creation, which is a little limiting. The rules are not all that well written. There's no mention of there being a max skill point here, but you're not actually determining skill points for your character at this stage. You're determining max skill points, which is a pool of resources that can later refill with rest, it looks like. The character sheet looks good. But, nothing about character creation is that compelling. You just basically have 3 stats, a set of skills that don't really have anything here that I find, because I don't think there's ever been a rule book that, has had skills that I've been like, oh wow, look at these skills. It's just a list of skills, but with having so little else to go on, you either need to put more into character creation in terms of lore, or more into mechanics, or somehow change the list of skills into something that has some inherent wow factor to it, because right now there's just not a lot going on for character creation. You can pick what area of the galaxy your character comes from, but it doesn't offer a ton of information, and it's called star signs for some reason, even though, like, to relate to astrology, but what astrology actually is in this context of this universe isn't explained. And it really sounds like just a general "where are you from in the universe" description. Specializations are entirely up to the player, so there's no draw that the rules are providing there. Like, I have my own complaints about, whether it should technically be called a skill specialization when it's more like a background/occupation, but that's an entirely separate issue just from, again, character creation is not providing an exciting option. It is just telling the player and game master to come up with it, which isn't like a bad thing in a system that has a draw. But like, so far there is not a huge reason to play this system except the world, and the world is not well defined in the rulebook. And then we get to, like, I already went over how I don't really love how gear works. How, there's like a decent amount of detail for some things, but not for how you actually get that well-defined gear. And that's not particularly balanced. And then the core mechanic is interesting. I can't speak to whether it exists in other places, but I've never seen it before. But it's a roll under system where you spend skill points to, achieve success, and that makes future checks harder. But you can also just spend health instead, and you actually do recover skill points for checks, so it's not really true that the more you fail, things become harder. It's more, they become harder for a while. And then the rules aren't actually outlined in plain text, and there's just flowcharts instead, which isn't terrible, but the order's a little off. The example of play comes before it's really outlined what you actually do. And even if this skill check was written out perfectly, I think, I certainly wouldn't have stopped reading as early as I did, probably. Okay, sorry. I just took a minute. I had to take a minute to gather my thoughts. The reason why, like, the skill checks as it is outlined could not be a draw, even if it was written more specifically. If you could not regain skill points, then that itself could be a draw to the system, because that really alters the tone and the difficulty, having things, always be going downhill if you try to succeed very hard. But, that isn't really the case, because you can rest to recover, it looks like. I'm going to reread this to make sure I actually know what I'm talking about. Yeah, you do recover skill points. So, it's just, I'm having a hard time seeing why anyone would really want to pick this book up. And I do have an idea for that. I'm pretty sure this is sort of just a framework skeleton that is supposed to be applied to the specific adventures that have a lot more detail of them. And that's just a guess based on seeing the kinds of other, projects that have been posted by this author, that it seems like the focus is the campaigns, and this is sort of just background. But this isn't really limited enough to be, an agnostic, rules light, easy to pick up thing. There's enough mechanics here that you really do have to look into it, and there's nothing in the book that itself makes it worth looking into, I feel like. And the additional materials might very well do that, but if you're going to make something like this, you want to have it to have its own value. And I'm not seeing a lot of reason to keep reading here. Like, I like the setting, but there's not a lot of detail in this book. And the rules are not super interesting, except for sort of the skill point system, but that is not written in the way that I would like it to be to read more.